Somewhere in his house, right now, there was a mark he'd been touching every day for 40 years, and never once seen. Elias Cormier didn't know that yet. That night, all he knew was the sound of his own traps, snapping shut in the dark, one after another, down the line. A sound with no business reaching him from a mile off, in country where sound wasn't supposed to travel that clean. Click. A pause. Click. Steady. Unhurried. Like footsteps checking doors down a hallway. He was almost a mile from every single one of them. 11 clicks. Then nothing. A silence so complete he could hear his own blood moving, and beneath it, fainter, the last dying pop of his campfire settling into ash. Elias lay still in his bedroll until morning, listening for a 12th click that never came. By the time this story ends, you'll understand why he never told most of it out loud, and why the part he did tell wasn't even the worst part. 3 weeks before that night, none of this would have made sense to him. Elias was a skeptic, a trapper by trade, and proud of it. He trusted his rifle, his compass, his own 2 hands. Nothing else. He'd grown up on stories at the trading post in Fort Simpson. Old men talked about a river valley to the north, where prospectors went in looking for gold and came out short ahead, if they came out at all. One story said a whole survey crew vanished in a single week, back before the First War, and only their tent stakes were ever found. Elias always smiled politely at those stories. Men liked to scare each other in the bush. It passed the long nights, and it cost nothing to nod along. That season, though, his usual grounds were picked clean. Other trappers had worked the same creeks all summer, and there was nothing left worth the walk. A man can't feed a winter on empty traps, and pride doesn't buy flour. He spent a full week weighing it before he made up his mind. There were other options: grounds further east, worked less hard but yielding less too, or a winter spent doing hired work in town instead of trapping at all. He turned each one over more than once. None of them sat right. The east grounds wouldn't cover what he needed, and hired work had never suited him. He tried it once, years back, and left after a season feeling more caged than he'd ever felt alone in the bush. The Nahanni was the only option left that could actually see him through the winter, stories or no stories, and Elias had never put much stock in stories. So Elias packed his canoe. He told no one where he was headed. He turned north, toward the one stretch of river even the boldest trappers wouldn't touch. The Nahanni. Getting there took 11 days. 11 days of paddling through water so cold it went numb through his gloves. The cliffs rose so high, so close together, that for hours at a time he never once saw direct sun. On the 4th day, he passed a canoe half sunk in the shallows, it hull stove in, no name painted anywhere on it. He didn't stop to look closer. He told himself it had been there for years, abandoned by someone who'd simply had enough of the river and walked out overland instead. The silence in that place was different from any silence he knew. Not the peaceful quiet of an empty forest. Heavier than that. The kind that makes a man lower his voice without meaning to, as if something up there might be listening for it. He told himself it was only wind, funneling through rock. The paddling itself nearly broke him before anything else got the chance. Twice, the current threw his canoe sideways into standing waves that filled it faster than he could bail. Once, a stretch of rapids forced him to portage half a mile over loose scree, the canoe on his shoulders, his rifle slung across his back, his legs shaking with every step. By the time he reached calmer water on the far side, his hands were raw enough that he couldn't close them around the paddle without wincing. He fell into a rhythm after that. Wake before light. Paddle until his shoulders locked up. Make camp early enough to check the ground before dark. It was hard work, but it was familiar work, and for the first several days that familiarity kept the valley's strangeness at arm's length. A man busy enough with his hands doesn't have much room left over for unease. By his 3rd week in, he'd built a working camp near a bend in the river, tucked beneath a limestone wall streaked black and grey like old, uneven teeth. The trapping was good there. Marten, mostly. A few red fox. For the first time since he'd arrived, Elias let himself believe the trip might pay off after all. He settled into the same routine he kept every season. Lines checked at first light, before the cold stiffened his fingers too badly to work the sets. Fire built up by mid-morning, smoked meat turned in the afternoon, gear mended in whatever daylight was left. It was the kind of routine that had carried him through a dozen winters without incident, and for 3 full days it carried him through this one the same way. That belief lasted exactly one more night. He found the mark for the first time at the edge of that camp, carved into a spruce trunk at chest height. 3 curved lines, raked downward and inward, meeting at a shallow point, like the base of a claw, except no claw he'd ever seen left a mark that deep or that deliberate. The bark around the cuts hadn't split or torn the way it would under real force. It looked drawn more than gouged, like something had taken its time. He ran his thumb along the grooves. Old damage, he decided. A bear, sharpening itself against the bark. He noticed, distantly, that the 3 lines were unusually even for an animal's claw, and that the depth didn't taper the way a claw mark tapers. But a man 3 weeks alone in the bush can't afford to sit with every small thing that nags at him. He turned away from it and went back to his fire, to the small orange comfort of its snapping and popping against a cold that had already started creeping in under his collar. That same night, he heard the sound for the first time. It came from somewhere up in the rocks, long after his fire had burned down to embers. Not quite a howl, not quite a scream, something unpleasantly in between, high, drawn out, in a way that didn't seem to belong to anything walking on 4 legs. The canyon walls caught it and threw it back at itself, layering the sound over its own echo until Elias couldn't tell anymore which direction it had first come from. It lasted perhaps 10 seconds. Then the valley folded back into a silence so complete that Elias could hear his own heart working in his chest. He sat up the rest of that night with his rifle across his knees. By morning, he'd talk himself back down. A wolf, he decided, an unusual one, its voice bent strangely by the canyon walls. He'd spent enough winters in the bush to know sound could play tricks up here. He almost believed himself. Almost is doing a lot of work in that sentence, and some part of him knew it even as he told it to himself. 2 nights later, the sound came again. Closer this time, or seeming closer, which in that canyon might have amounted to the same thing. He didn't bother making himself an excuse for it a second time. He just listened until it stopped, and then he checked the load in his rifle, though he already knew it was full. The next morning, he found the tracks. They were pressed into a strip of mud along the riverbank, near his 3rd trapline. Deep, unusually wide. Nothing in the guidebook he carried matched them. Not bare, the stride was too long, too evenly spaced, as if whatever made them had walked upright for a stretch before dropping back onto all 4s. He measured one against the length of his own boot without meaning to, and it was longer by a hand's width on either side. He crouched over them a long while, turning his skinning knife in his hand, and this time he didn't try very hard to explain them away. He'd already used up his best excuses on the mark and the sound. There wasn't much left to reach for. Beside the tracks, carved fresh into a fallen log, was the mark again. 3 curved lines. The same shallow point where they met. He didn't sleep well after that either. The next few days brought no new sign, no sound, no fresh tracks, no new marks, and Elias almost let himself relax. But the feeling of being watched didn't leave with the evidence. It followed him down the trapline in broad daylight, an itch between his shoulder blades that made him turn around more than once to find nothing behind him but trees. He'd felt watched in the bush before, plenty of times, and it had always turned out to be nothing. This time, the feeling didn't go away when he told himself that. Something smaller happened next, smaller than the tracks, smaller than the sound, and somehow worse than either. His traps started being disturbed. Not raided the way a bear or wolverine raids a trapline, tearing the bait apart and leaving a mess behind. These were untouched. Simply moved. Lifted clean off the ground where he'd set them and placed back down a few feet away. Gently, deliberately, the way a curious hand might pick something up, turn it over, and set it back exactly where it pleased. An animal doesn't do that. 2 mornings after that, he found a second trap moved the same way, further down the line, closer to camp than the first. He reset it without much hope it would matter. It didn't. The next day, that same trap had been moved again, and this time it had been left sitting on top of a flat stone, arranged almost like an offering laid out for him to find. Whatever was doing this wasn't just curious about his gear anymore. It was working its way toward him, and it wanted him to notice it doing so. The morning after that, he found the mark carved directly into a trap stake, close enough to camp that he could see it from where he'd slept. That same morning, he found something else. One of his marten, still caught and still dead in its trap, had been taken out, laid flat on a rock, and arranged with its paws folded together across its chest, deliberate as a burial. Nothing had fed on it. Nothing had torn it apart. It had simply been rearranged, the way a man might straighten a picture frame he'd walked past a dozen times without noticing it was crooked. That was when Elias stopped telling himself stories. He decided, right then, that it was time to go. He sat with that decision for a while before acting on it, turning over every reason a careful man might have for staying instead. The good trapping, the marten still worth collecting, the fact that nothing had actually touched him, not once, in 3 full weeks. Every reason held up fine in daylight. None of them held up once he pictured another night listening for that 11th click. In the end, it wasn't fear that decided it, or not fear alone. It was the plain, practical arithmetic of a man who'd spent his whole life reading sign in the bush, and who understood, better than most, exactly what kind of sign this was. He broke camp faster than he had ever broken camp in his life. His hands wouldn't quite stop shaking as he loaded the canoe, and he told himself the whole time that this was simple good sense and had nothing to do with fear, a distinction that mattered less and less the longer he thought about it. He left 2 of his traps behind rather than walk back up the line to collect them. 3 hours downriver, the canyon walls finally began to widen and let more sky through. That was when he saw the second camp. He would think back on this moment more than any other in the years that followed. The last clean choice he ever made in that valley, the last point where turning around would have cost him nothing but a bruised sense of his own good judgment. It wasn't marked on any map he carried. A single canvas tent, half collapsed, sagging against a fallen spruce near the water's edge, its fabric gone grey and brittle with age. No smoke. No sound. Nothing that said anyone had passed through here in a long time. Elias knew, with total clarity, that he should keep paddling. He beached the canoe anyway. Walking up slow, rifle in hand, he pulled back the stiffened flap of the tent. Inside, a bedroll, a rusted tin cup, still sitting upright by cold ash, as if someone had meant to come back for it. A folded shirt, gone stiff with damp. A small leather journal, swollen thick with old water. A canvas sack in the corner held a few tins of food, unopened, and a coil of rope that had gone soft and grey with rot. Nothing that suggested a struggle. Nothing that suggested a hurry, even. No pack, no boots, no rifle of his own, as if the man had simply stood up one night and walked out into the dark without stopping to take anything with him. Elias picked up the journal. He'd tell people afterward that he wasn't sure why, that his hand moved before his mind agreed to it. He flipped past the early pages first, almost without meaning to. The first entries were ordinary. Weather notes. A sketch of the river bend. One line, dated only by season, read, "Good water here, good fishing near the side creek. Might winter over if the trapping holds." Whoever had written this had come here the same way Elias had, for the work, not for trouble, and for a while, it seemed, the trouble hadn't found him either. Then he turned to the last written page. The ink had bled and faded across the years, but a few lines were still legible. The handwriting grew visibly less steady with each sentence, the pen pressing harder and harder into the paper, as if the man writing it had needed to hold onto something solid. Something is out there at night. It knows the camp is here. I heard it get closer again last night, closer than before. There is a mark it leaves, 3 lines, always the same 3 lines, and I have started finding it closer to the tent every morning. Tomorrow I will try to make it downriver at first light. If I do not, I want it written somewhere that I was not imagining this. No date. No name signed beneath it. Elias closed the journal. That should have been the end of it. The part of the story he'd tell at the trading post that winter. The part people would nod politely at before changing the subject. It wasn't the end. As he turned to leave the tent, his boot caught on a loose fold of canvas at the back corner, and the whole rotted wall came away in his hand. Behind, it was a narrow gap in the rock, barely wide enough for a man to turn sideways through. Hidden, entirely, by the tent's placement, the kind of opening you'd never notice unless you were standing exactly where Elias now stood. Cold air moved out of it, carrying a smell he didn't have a word for. Not decay, exactly. Something colder than that. Older. He should have walked away. He told himself that for the rest of his life, on every night he couldn't sleep, he should have walked straight back to his canoe and never looked back. Instead, he lit a length of birch bark and stepped inside. The passage opened, after only a few yards, into a low chamber. What his light found there wasn't the man from the tent. It wasn't any one thing at all. The walls were covered in the mark. Dozens of them, carved at intervals that felt almost patient, almost unhurried. Some grooves were worn soft and pale with age. Others were cut so recently the stone dust still sat loose in the lines. Beneath each mark sat a small collection of belongings. A rusted compass. A wedding band, gone black with tarnish. A boot buckle. A child's carved wooden toy, small enough to fit in one hand, its paint long since worn away. A pocket watch, stopped, its glass face cracked in a single line across the middle. A second journal, and a third, their leather gone stiff and pale as bone. Decades of them. Longer than decades, judging by how far back into the dark the marks continued, past the reach of his little torch, further than he had any intention of following them. Near the entrance, the marks were sharp and recent. Deeper in, they grew shallow and soft, worn down not by time exactly, but by something closer to touch, the way a stone step wears smooth under 100 years of the same footfall. He counted 11 marks before he made himself stop counting, and he understood, without wanting to, that 11 was nowhere near all of them. Some of the belongings beneath the oldest marks had gone to nothing but a stain on the rock, whatever leather or cloth they'd once been reduced to a dark, dry outline of its own shape. It wasn't hunting men for meat. He understood that now, standing very still in that cold, patient dark. It was keeping them, marking each one, carefully, the way a man might notch a calendar, setting aside some small piece of them, the way another man might press a flower into a book to remember the year. He had walked into somebody's ledger. He took one step further in anyway, some part of him needing to know how far back the marks actually went, and it was in that single extra step that he understood the chamber wasn't as empty as it had first looked. The air moved differently a few yards ahead. Not a draft, exactly, more like the air itself had somewhere else to be around whatever was standing in it. Somewhere deeper in the chamber, past where his light could reach, something shifted. Not a footstep. Not quite. Just the sound of weight settling, patient, unhurried. The same rhythm as the traps clicking shut, a mile away, 3 weeks from now, in a memory he hadn't lived yet and never would explain to anyone who asked. Elias didn't remember leaving the chamber. He remembered being in his canoe, paddling harder than he had ever paddled in his life, the birch torch still burning uselessly on the riverbank behind him where he must have dropped it. His arms gave out somewhere around the second bend, and he kept paddling anyway, on nothing but the memory of how to do it. The current helped him more than his own strength did by the end, carrying him faster than he could have managed alone, as if even the river wanted him gone from that stretch of rock. He didn't stop again until full dark forced him to, and even then he didn't sleep, just sat with his back against a rock and his rifle across his knees, listening to a valley that, for once, gave him nothing back but silence. 4 days later, he reached Fort Simpson, half-starved, sunburned, unable to hold a coffee cup without spilling it. That winter, he told his story once at the trading post. Most people nodded politely and said nothing, the particular kind of nothing you offer a man who's clearly still a little rattled, and let him have his drink in peace. The old-timers didn't laugh, though. Not this time. Not the ones who'd told him the stories in the first place, the ones he used to smile politely past. One of them got up quietly and left before Elias had even finished. Another, a younger man who'd only ever heard the story secondhand, asked Elias to describe the mark a second time, and then a third, writing something down in a small notebook of his own before folding it away without a word of explanation. The one who stayed the longest, a riverman named Prout, went very quiet when Elias described the mark. He set his own cup down slowly, like he didn't trust his hand with it anymore. "You're lucky you left when the trap started moving," Prout said. "That's usually the last warning you get, before it starts leaving you something to remember it by." Elias asked him what he meant. Prout looked at him for a long moment, like he was deciding something, and then he shook his head and said only that some things were better left where man found them, and that a man who went looking for answers in that country usually found more of them than he wanted. He wouldn't say any more that night, or any night after, not even years later, when Elias tried asking him again, half joking, over a much calmer drink. By then Prout was an old man himself, and he only smiled and changed the subject, the way Elias used to do to other men, back before he'd had a reason not to. Elias never went back to the Nahanni. He kept the journal from the abandoned tent in a drawer for the rest of his life. He never once learned whose handwriting filled its pages, or what became of the man who wrote those final unsteady lines by lamplight, alone, in a valley that still doesn't give up its secrets easily. He told the story only a handful of times after that first winter, less and less as the years went on, until eventually he stopped telling it at all. Not because he'd come to disbelieve it. People who knew him said that clearly wasn't it. If anything, the opposite. He married, raised a family, spent 40 years working a trapline half the size of his old grounds and twice as safe, and he never once spoke about the Nahanni without a kind of care most men reserve for funerals. Something else happened, eventually, that made him stop telling it altogether. Something that made even that careful version feel like too much. It happened at his grandson's kitchen table, some 40 years later, the winter before he died. He'd just finished describing the chamber, the belongings arranged beneath each mark, when his grandson, without any prompting, without ever having heard this story before that night, went very still across the table. For a moment neither of them said anything, the kitchen quiet in a way that reminded Elias, though he couldn't have said why, of a canyon he hadn't seen in 40 years. Then the boy got up quietly from the table, walked to the mudroom, came back holding the old wooden canoe paddle that had hung above the fireplace for as long as anyone could remember. The paddle Elias had carried out of the Nahanni himself, the one he never used again. His grandson set it down on the table between them. Carved into the base of the handle, worn soft and pale with 40 years of handling, were 3 curved lines, raked downward and inward, meeting at a shallow point. Elias stared at it a long time without speaking. He had carried that paddle out of the valley himself. He had held it in his own 2 hands nearly every day since. He had never once noticed the mark was already there.